this vignette, the issues of career, gender, and disability are discussed.
Jay, last week we initially, after we met, I was thinking a lot about, you were talking about feeling some conflict, and we didn't really get to that in terms of the inner conflict you're feeling about this pull between relationship and career. And I thought maybe we could start off there today talking about that. If you could let me know a little bit more about what that conflict is you're feeling.
Yeah, well, basically, like I mentioned last week, I want to go to graduate school. I want to go on for my PhD. And the problem with that is that my wife is in a career here.
Right.
And she's working on her master's here. And I don't want to make her give up all that to kind of follow me off to get my PhD.
I wonder how Jay would deal with the demands of a doctoral program.
Of me doing that, I don't know if I feel guilty about asking her that or what.
So some conflict about putting your needs first.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
So you're wanting to do, I know you got your master's, you're wanting to do a PhD.
Yeah.
In what area?
Probably rehabilitation psychology. I have my master's in voc rehab. I would like to continue on with that.
That's kind of a big step to go from master's to a PhD. Much longer time commitment. I guess more intense demands, and I'm wondering how you feel about making that step, and if you feel that that's something that you're ready for, up for, something.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I've looked into all that. I mean, I understand that it's a big step, and there's a lot of work. But I don't know why that would. I mean, I think I'm ready to do that. I don't know why that would have any. I don't think that's the big part of it. You know?
I guess I wasn't sure where you're going, because I think PhD is a big commitment, and I don't know.
Does she think I can't succeed in grad school because of the disability?
I'm wondering if that was an okay choice or the right choice.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm feeling like you're questioning my ability to do that. Is there a reason for that?
Oh no, I think I really offended him. I guess, I mean, I don't feel like I doubt your ability. I don't know anything about your academic ability. I think it's just often a big step to go into doctoral work, and I guess I was trying to get a sense of if that was something that you had really thought through, and it sounds like that's not the issue. And
I'm not sure I buy that, but I'll give her another chance.
Direction.
Okay.
I guess I want to try to get back on the course that I guess we originally went, which was your relationship. How have you and your wife in the past talked about give and take in a relationship?
We haven't really had that many problems with it in the past, actually. Things just kind of fell in place pretty well up until this point. And now I guess that we're kind of there. I'm not sure really, I guess, I don't know if we're doing the right things or not, but I know that I'm having problems sleeping at night and kind of just staying awake staring at the walls thinking about, what am I going to do? Is this the right move? And can I ask this of her? And, and can we afford it? And that kind of thing.
I guess I wonder, and this, I may be totally off in terms of this, but I'm just wondering if in terms of when you're trying to make joint decisions, if you're ever concerned that, as you struggle with or deal with issues in regards to your own career and those sort of choices and integrating that with your disability, if you're sometimes concerned that...
Here we go again with the disability thing.
In a sense, maybe your wife might try to meet your needs because of that, or if that's ever an issue.
If you mean if she's feeling sorry for me and that's, well, Jay's going to do it and I need to take care of him, I mean, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think the relationship would have gone as far as it's gone if that's the basis for it. I mean, that's. So I hope not, but I don't think so.
Okay. So you feel like that's not something that you ever sort of fear or wonder in the back of your mind. You feel pretty trusting in terms of her motives and her sort of negotiating issues with you up till this point. It hasn't been an issue.
No, I was in the chair long before I met her, and if the chair is going to turn somebody off, it's going to turn them off when they see it. It's not like she was hanging on to me and then I was in an accident or something. You know, it's sort of the pity wife or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
I don't see that as happening, and I certainly don't like that to happen with people. And
I think I'm making a lot of incorrect assumptions.
It's my way of getting around. So.
Yeah. So maybe it's more an issue of not always or maybe doubting that she's not necessarily as assertive about her own needs.
Yeah, I think that may have a lot to do with it too.
So feeling like, separate from how it relates to you, that just in a personal sense, she might be likely to make her own needs secondary.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't know if that's the old, I don't know, cultural thing or you need
gender
to
thing.
Yeah, the gender thing with you need to do what the husband says you need to do. I don't know if that's what it is or not. I certainly try to get her to express herself and tell me how she's really feeling about it, and that's okay with me, to let me know. If that's not what she wants to do, then maybe we can look at some other options.
Have the two of you talked about gender issues as they relate to your relationship? Is that an area that you've, in a sense, discussed in the past in terms of, do you tend to operate from more traditional assumptions, or tend to try to move past that, or?
I don't think it's ever really been, we've never actually had a conversation about that or discussed it. I guess I may need to give this gender issue some more thought. I guess probably it would be more traditional for the most part, but if I see something like that happening, I try to throw it back on her, I guess, and say, look, I want to make sure that you're comfortable with this, and not try to make all those. I don't know that she's real good about doing that.
But when you're aware of it, you make notice of it and
I try to
and try to at least acknowledge that.
But I'm sure there's times that I'm not aware of it. I think it's, I don't know.
Well, it sounds like it's enough of an issue for you that in the back of your mind you just have this little question that says, even though you didn't voice it this way initially, I don't want Lisa to silence her own needs for mine. And that somewhat of a fear that she might.
Yeah, I think that's...
I think there are more gender dynamics here than he is aware of.
No. Because she kind of says, yeah, that's okay with me if that's what you want to do. How can I find out if it's okay with her?
Right. Well, it seems like there's a lot of questions left, and maybe that's the direction we need to move next, is getting concrete. Where do you go from here?